December 1942, Teburba, Tunisia, North Africa. The air above the Majerda Valley sat thick and still, the way it always did before something terrible arrived. A thin film of red Tunisian dust clung to everything, to the wool coats of American soldiers, to the olive-painted hulls of their M4 Sherman tanks, to the lips of the men who had only just begun to understand what this war truly demanded of them. It was late autumn in the desert, and the cold came down sharp at night. But by midday, the sun pressed hard against the steel of the vehicles, and inside the turrets, the air smelled of engine oil, cordite residue, and the sweat of young men from Ohio and Georgia and Wisconsin, who had never before heard the sound of an 88mm shell splitting the sky at 1,200 meters per second. Before the engagement that would change everything, a tank commander, his name recorded in the unit logs of the 1st Armored Division, poured himself a cup of coffee from a battered thermos he had carried all the way from Fort Knox, Kentucky. The coffee was black, strong, still faintly warm. He drank it slowly. He looked out across the flat approach roads that ran toward the German-held town. He could see dust rising in the middle distance. He assumed, as many of his fellow commanders assumed in those early days, that what was coming toward him was no different from what they had already faced. A tank was a tank, steel against steel. This was the calculation of men who had trained on doctrine and expected the battlefield to behave accordingly. The coffee went cold before he could finish it. What rolled out of that dust in the winter of 1942 was not what any American tanker had been trained to fight. It was something else entirely. Something heavier, something slower and more deliberate in its movement, the way a very large predator moves, not with urgency, but with the complete confidence of a creature that has no natural enemy in its environment. The Panzerkampfwagen 6, Ausführung E, the Tiger. 57 metric tons of German industrial philosophy made into armor and fire. And it did not hurry. It did not need to. The story of American tank crews and the Tiger is not simply a story about a weapon. It is a story about fear, rational, documented, and deeply human fear. It is a story about what happens when young men trained in the confidence of their nation's industrial power encounter something that their industrial power, for a long time, simply could not match. It is a story about the gap between expectation and reality, and between the gleaming promise of the factory floor and the brutal arithmetic of armor plate and muzzle velocity on the killing grounds of North Africa, Italy, Normandy, and the Ardennes. And it is, ultimately, a story about how those men, frightened, outgunned, and acutely aware of their own vulnerability, fought anyway, and in fighting, changed the outcome of the war. To understand the terror that the Tiger produced in the minds and bodies of American tank crews, it is necessary to understand what those men were given to fight with. The M4 Sherman medium tank was, by any reasonable accounting, a competent machine. It was reliable. It was mechanically simple enough that a trained crew could repair it in the field. It was fast on roads, capable of nearly 30 miles per hour, and its drivetrain was rugged enough to survive the kind of sustained operational use that German tanks, engineered to tighter tolerances, frequently could not. The Sherman could be shipped across oceans. It could be loaded onto landing craft. And it could be produced in vast numbers, and numbers, as the American military establishment firmly believed, would decide the war. By the time production peaked, American factories were turning out Sherman tanks at a rate that the German armaments industry could not begin to approach. In the end, over 49,000 M4 Shermans would roll off American assembly lines. The strategy was as clear as it was cold. If Germany built one exceptional tank, America would build 10 good enough tanks and overwhelm it with arithmetic. But arithmetic, as the men of the 1st Armored Division discovered in the red dust of Tunisia, does not feel comforting when you are sitting inside 51 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor and the tank across the valley is wearing 102 millimeters on its face and carrying a gun that can kill you from a mile and a half away. The Sherman's primary armament through most of the war was the M3 75mm gun, and it was a capable weapon against most German armor of the period. The Panzer III and Panzer IV could be engaged and destroyed at standard combat ranges. But against the Tiger I, the M3 75mm was effectively useless against the frontal armor at any combat distance. The gun could put a round directly into the Tiger's glacis plate at 500 meters, and the round would shatter or ricochet, or simply fail to penetrate. To kill a Tiger from the front with a standard Sherman 75mm was not a tactic. It was a hope, and a desperate one. The Tiger's own gun, the 88mm KWK-36, derived directly from the legendary Flak 18 anti-aircraft cannon that German crews had famously used as an anti-tank weapon in the Spanish Civil War and across the North African desert, could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. The arithmetic of that disparity was not lost on the men who lived inside it. The Tiger could kill a Sherman before the Sherman could see it clearly. The Sherman could not kill a Tiger even when it was close enough to read the tactical numbers painted on its turret. This asymmetry was not a minor tactical inconvenience. It was a fundamental psychological condition that shaped the experience of American armor warfare from 1942 through nearly the end of the war in Europe. The word that Army psychiatrists and intelligence officers recorded in their reports, borrowing from the German accounts of what their own panzer crews described witnessing in Soviet tankers on the Eastern Front when the first Tigers appeared, was tiger phobia. Tiger phobia. It was a clinical-sounding term for something that was, at its core, primal and precise. Men were afraid of the Tiger not because they lacked courage. They were afraid of it because they understood, with complete clarity, what it meant to meet one. The Tiger's history began in the engineering rooms of Henschel und Sohn in Kassel, Germany, where the Wehrmacht's demand for a heavy breakthrough tank had been grinding through bureaucratic channels since the late 1930s. Adolf Hitler, who took a personal and often counterproductive interest in the development of German armored vehicles, had pushed for heavier, more powerful designs, even as his generals cautioned that such machines would be difficult to produce in adequate numbers and prone to mechanical breakdown. The resulting competition between Henschel and Porsche produced, after considerable delay and political turbulence, the tank that would bear the name of the most feared predator in the European imagination. The Tiger I entered combat service in August 1942, deployed along the Leningrad front in small numbers under conditions that exposed every mechanical weakness the design possessed. The early Tigers broke down constantly, and their suspension system, a complex, interleaved road wheel arrangement designed to distribute the vehicle's enormous weight, was prone to jamming in the mud and frozen ground of the Eastern Front. In winter, the wheels could freeze together overnight, immobilizing the tank before the first shot was fired. But the mechanical difficulties of early production models did not diminish what the Tiger represented when it functioned as intended. And when it functioned as intended, it was unlike anything the Allies had encountered. Soviet tank crews on the Eastern Front had learned this in blood before American crews in North Africa learned it in shock. The Tiger was not merely a better tank than what it faced. It was a tank that occupied a different category of threat, something that changed the rules of engagement not by degree, but by kind. When the Tiger arrived in North Africa in late November and December of 1942, it came as part of the broader German reinforcement of Tunisia in response to the Allied Operation Torch Landings. The 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion deployed a small number of Tiger Is to the Tunisian front. and their initial encounters with British and American armor produced results that traveled quickly through Allied intelligence channels and faster still through the informal networks by which fighting men pass information to one another. The men of the U.S. 1st Armored Division, still finding their footing as a combat formation, still carrying the raw confidence of a force that had never yet been truly tested against the best Germany had to offer, received their first Tiger contacts in the fighting around Taburba and later at the Kasserine Pass. Kasserine, in February 1943, was the moment when the full dimension of American unpreparedness came into devastating focus. The battle at Kasserine Pass was not solely or even primarily a Tiger engagement. It involved the full range of German armor and the tactical genius of Erwin Rommel, who understood how to use combined arms in ways that the American command structure was not yet equipped to counter. But the presence of Tiger tanks among the German forces that crashed through the American lines and drove Second Corps back 50 miles in 3 days left an impression that went far deeper than any after-action report could fully capture. American soldiers saw their tanks burning. They saw the gap between what they had been told and what was happening. They saw, for the first time, what the war actually was. The coffee thermos appeared again in the accounts of survivors from those weeks, mentioned not in any single document, but woven through oral histories and letters as a kind of shorthand for the ordinary lives that American soldiers carried with them into extraordinary circumstances. A crew sharing the last of their coffee before climbing back into a tank they were not certain they would exit. The small domestic ritual of warmth and comfort pressed against the cold machinery of industrial killing. It was a distinctly American image, the working man's sustenance, the democratic beverage, the thing that tasted like home, and it existed in the starkest possible contrast to the steel monster that waited beyond the ridgeline. The Sherman tank was sometimes called, in those early months of combat, the Ronson. And the name came from a popular American cigarette lighter whose advertising slogan declared that it lit first time, every time. The men who applied that nickname to their vehicle were not speaking of reliability in any positive sense. They were speaking of fire. The Sherman had a persistent and deadly tendency to catch fire when penetrated by enemy rounds, and the 88mm shell, traveling at over 900 meters per second through the Sherman's thin frontal plate, invariably reached the ammunition stowage or the fuel lines with enough energy remaining to ignite what it touched. British crews, who lost as many men to burning Shermans as to the penetrating rounds themselves, called it the Tommy Cooker. The statistical reality behind these nicknames was sobering. A significant proportion of Sherman crew casualties were caused not by the initial penetration of the armor, but by the fire that followed. Such men who survived the impact of a round found themselves trapped inside a tank that was rapidly becoming an oven. The average time between catastrophic penetration and complete vehicle fire in a fuel-ignited Sherman could be measured in seconds. Before addressing the Army's institutional response, it is worth dwelling on what the men themselves did in the immediate aftermath of a Tiger encounter. What happened in the hours after a crew scrambled out of a burning Sherman and reorganized in a ditch or behind a stone wall or in the doorway of a farmhouse, their ears ringing, their hands shaking, the technical knowledge of the armor disparity now vivid and personal in a way that no intelligence briefing could have made it. They were checked for wounds. They were given water. In most cases, they were given another Sherman as quickly as one could be found, and they were sent back. This was not cruelty on the part of the Army. It was the operational logic of a war being fought on a compressed timeline, and it was also, in its way, a recognition that the men who had already met the Tiger were more valuable than green crews who had not. They had information. They had calibrated fear. Fear that told them exactly how much respect the Tiger demanded and how to survive the encounter by navigating its edges, rather than meeting it head-on. In the Army's brutal arithmetic, a traumatized crew with direct Tiger experience was still a functioning combat asset, and so they climbed back in. The Army's response to this vulnerability was incremental and, for much of the war, insufficient. Bulge stowage systems, which surrounded the main gun ammunition with a water glycol mixture to reduce the likelihood of cook-off, were introduced in later production variants and retrofit programs. Additional armor applique was welded onto the hulls of some Shermans in field workshops. Crews improvised their own additions, piling sandbags against the hull sides, hanging spare track links over the frontal plate, attaching any available material that might add even a few millimeters of standoff distance between the outside world and the living men inside. None of these improvisations changed the fundamental equation. The Sherman was what it was, a medium tank built for reliability, logistics, and mass production, sent to fight a heavy tank built for dominance. And the men who served inside it knew it. Between Tunisia and Normandy lay Italy, and the Italian campaign gave American armor another theater in which to measure itself against the Tiger in terrain that, if anything, was even more favorable to the defender than the Tunisian desert or the Norman bocage. The Italian peninsula's long spine of the Apennine Mountains, its narrow coastal plains, its rivers running perpendicular to any northward axis of advance, its medieval hill towns and ancient stone bridges, all of it created a defensive landscape so naturally formidable that a small number of Tiger tanks, properly positioned, could hold a road against an entire armored column for hours. The men of the 1st Armored Division, who had survived Tunisia and been rebuilt and refitted in the months following the North African victory, arrived in Italy in the autumn and winter of 1943, and immediately encountered the same problem they had faced on the other side of the Mediterranean, compressed and intensified by the topography. A Tiger at the far end of a mountain pass was not merely a tactical obstacle. It was a wall. And walls in Italy were everywhere. The fighting around Monte Cassino, which would eventually involve some of the bloodiest and most protracted combat of the entire European campaign, saw American and Allied armor used in conditions for which medium tanks had never been designed. The Sherman's road speed was meaningless on mountain tracks that could barely support wheeled vehicles. Its ability to range freely across open ground was irrelevant in a theater where open ground did not exist. And the Tiger, deployed in small numbers by the Germans with the same precision and economy that characterized their use of elite heavy tank units throughout the war, also extracted a price from every American armored advance that was felt in the daily casualty returns of units whose official histories record the losses in the flat language of military bureaucracy and cannot begin to capture what those numbers meant to the living men who counted them. Each tank lost to a Tiger round in the Italian hills represented a crew, 5 men, their individual histories compressed into a vehicle number and a date. And the cumulative weight of those losses fell not only on the families who received the telegrams, but on the surviving crewmates who had witnessed the destruction and would go on witnessing it in memory for the rest of their lives. Italy also produced, within the American armor community, a refinement of the tactical knowledge that had begun in Tunisia. The infantry armor coordination that had been improvised in North Africa was studied, documented, and taught in the months of preparation for the Normandy invasion. The lessons about Tiger engagement, the necessity of flanking, the importance of combined arms, the value of calling for air or artillery support before committing armor to a confined advance, were absorbed and institutionalized to the degree that any lesson learned in blood can be institutionalized before the blood is dry. The men who crossed the English Channel in June 1944 were better prepared than the men who had landed at Oran in November 1942, and that improvement was measured in specific tactical knowledge about a specific enemy vehicle, passed from veteran to replacement in the informal classrooms of mess tents and vehicle maintenance areas in the months before the invasion. What is remarkable, and what the historical record bears out with unmistakable clarity, is that those men fought anyway. They did not refuse to advance. They did not abandon their vehicles. They drove their Shermans toward Tiger tanks that could kill them at ranges where they could not yet return effective fire. And they used every tactic available to them: terrain, smoke, speed, numbers, artillery coordination, air support, to do what their guns alone could not. The story of American armor in World War II is not, at its core, a story of superior equipment. It is a story of superior will applied through superior numbers under conditions of sustained technological disadvantage. It is, in that sense, a deeply American story. The psychological dimension of fighting in an outgunned tank deserves more consideration than it typically receives in the official histories. The men who climbed into Shermans in the hedgerow country of Normandy in the summer of 1944 had by that point spent months, in the case of veteran crews, and over a year, absorbing reports, rumors, and direct observations of what Tigers did to Shermans and to the men inside them. The intelligence community had done its work thoroughly. By 1944, American tankers had access to detailed technical assessments of the Tiger's armor profile, gun performance, and optimum engagement protocols. They knew the exact range at which the Tiger's 88mm could defeat their frontal armor. They knew the precise angles at which their own guns had any chance of penetrating Tiger plate. They had done the mathematics. And the mathematics were not encouraging. What was left, after the mathematics, was discipline. The discipline to climb in, to button up the hatch, to move out. The summer of 1944 brought the full weight of the Tiger encounter to American tank forces in a new and more confined theater. The Normandy Bocage, the ancient network of earthen banks and hedgerows that divided the Norman countryside into small, enclosed fields, robbed American armor of its natural advantages. Speed was irrelevant in terrain where a Sherman could not see more than 100 meters in any direction. The ability to maneuver was sharply constrained by the narrow lanes and the dense vegetation. The Tiger, slow and heavy, was at its most formidable in defensive positions where it could select its ground and wait. And wait it did. The Germans understood the bocage as a defensive asset of the First Order. A single Tiger positioned hull down behind a hedgerow, with only its thick turret face exposed, was nearly impervious to frontal attack. The narrow lanes that American tank columns were forced to travel provided the Tiger's gunner with predictable, channelized targets at ranges where the 88mm could not miss. American after-action reports from the Normandy bocage fighting make for grim reading. Columns advancing along sunken roads lost their lead tank to a Tiger round fired from somewhere in the green wall ahead. The column stopped. More rounds came. More tanks burned. The infantry that was supposed to protect the tanks from ambush was itself suppressed by the fire. The hedgerow battles of June and July 1944 were, for American armor, a sustained exercise in the management of mechanical fear in enclosed spaces. It was in this context, on the morning of June 13, 1944, that the single most dramatic individual Tiger action of the entire war occurred on the road between Villers-Bocage and Point 213 in Normandy. SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, commanding a single Tiger, one of the 2nd Company, 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, encountered a halted column of the British 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, on the Villers-Bocage Main Street and in the surrounding fields. In an engagement lasting approximately 15 minutes, Wittmann's single Tiger destroyed 14 tanks, 15 personnel carriers, and 2 anti-tank guns, effectively ending the British 7th Armored's attempt to exploit the Villers-Bocage gap. The action has since become one of the most analyzed and debated tank engagements of the entire war, both for what it accomplished tactically and for what it revealed about the Tiger's capacity to operate with virtual impunity against Allied armor in enclosed terrain. Wittmann was not, it must be said, acting in isolation. Other Tigers from his company participated in the broader engagement around Villers-Bocage, but his individual action on the main street of the town that morning stands as the most concentrated demonstration of what a single Tiger, correctly handled by a skilled commander in favorable terrain, could do to Allied armored formations. The news traveled quickly across the Allied armored community. It confirmed what many had already come to believe and what some had not yet fully accepted, that the Tiger was not merely a formidable opponent. It was a potentially battle-decisive weapon when deployed correctly, and the armies that opposed it needed a response that went far beyond simply sending more Shermans down the same roads. The response came in several forms, and none of them individually sufficient, but collectively effective enough to prevent the Tiger from determining the outcome of the war in the West. And at the heart of that response was something that cannot be reduced to tactics or technology: the specific moral character of the American armored soldier, who had been forged in the furnaces of Kasserine and Cassino and the Bocage into something harder and more precise than the eager young men who had arrived in North Africa 2 years earlier. These were experienced men, tired men, men who had buried enough crewmates to understand exactly what the job entailed, and they brought to their work a quality that is difficult to name: part professionalism, part stubbornness, part the particular American unwillingness to accept that a problem is insoluble, that proved, in the final accounting, to be as decisive as any tank gun or armor plate in the Allied order of battle. The first tactical response was flanking, bringing fire onto the Tiger's side armor, which at 80 millimeters was significantly thinner than the frontal plate and could be penetrated by the Sherman 75 millimeters at close range, and by the later Sherman 76 millimeter at more comfortable distances. Flanking a Tiger in open country was a dangerous proposition, requiring multiple tanks to draw the Tiger's attention while another vehicle maneuvered into a position of advantage. It required sacrifice. One tank would advance to draw fire, exposing itself to the 88 millimeter, while others moved to the sides. The crews of the bait tank understood their role. They accepted it. That acceptance, quiet, unrecorded, expressed in no formal document, represents one of the most profound moral acts of the entire armored war. The second response was air power. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the ground attack variant of Republic Aviation's remarkable fighter, proved devastatingly effective against Tiger tanks when flown by trained pilots in suitable conditions. The P-47 carried rockets and bombs capable of defeating Tiger armor from above, the tank's thinnest point, and, in the open country beyond the Bocage, Allied air superiority translated directly into Tiger kills that ground forces alone could not achieve. The coordination between Sherman crews on the ground and Thunderbolt pilots in the air became one of the most tactically significant partnerships of the European campaign. Tank commanders learned to mark Tiger positions with colored smoke. Pilots learned to work the radio nets with ground controllers embedded in armored units. The result was a combined arms capability that, and when it worked, and weather and terrain often prevented it from working, could neutralize the Tiger's ground-level dominance. The veterans who spoke of their experience decades after the war consistently returned to the sound. The specific sonic signature of the 88 millimeter gun had, by late 1943, become so well known among Allied tank crews that it was reportedly possible to distinguish it from other artillery pieces by ear alone. The crack of the round passing overhead, the slightly different, shorter, more percussive impact if the round struck something nearby. The grinding, tearing, unmistakable sound of a round entering a tank. Veterans described the sound as one that never left them, that could be recalled 50 years later with the same physical immediacy as the day it was first heard. Sound carries fear in a way that vision cannot. You can choose not to look. The ears are always open. By the spring of 1945, the landscape of the armored war had changed in ways that reflected the exhaustion of German industrial and human capital. Tiger units that had fought with full complements of vehicles and experienced crews in 1942 and 1943 were, by 1945, operating with partially trained crews, reduced maintenance support, and chronic fuel shortages that limited operational reach. The 501st, 502nd, and 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalions, the units that had been the spearhead of German armored power in North Africa and on the Eastern Front, had been attrited to fractions of their original strength. Replacement crews received weeks of training where their predecessors had received months. The mechanical complexity that made the Tiger a demanding vehicle to operate and maintain had not decreased, but the expertise available to manage that complexity had. Tigers that had survived the entire Normandy campaign in August 1944 were now being abandoned for lack of fuel, out or destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. American tank crews advancing into Germany in March and April 1945 entered a theater that was, in some respects, almost surreal in the reversal it represented. The same roads and towns that German armor had defended with such ferocity in the winter now lay open, their defenders reduced to improvised Volkssturm formations with anti-tank weapons and the occasional isolated Tiger or King Tiger, dangerous still, implacably so, but no longer part of a coherent defensive system. Shermans that had spent 3 years as the prey in an unequal encounter now moved through a defeated landscape with a freedom of action that their predecessors in Tunisia or Normandy could not have imagined. The Tiger's dominance had been real, extended, and costly, but it had not been permanent. Nothing built with German steel on German factory floors in the winter of 1943 could be permanent when the skies above those factories were filling with Allied bombers, and the oil that fed the tanks was running out, and the soldiers who had driven those tanks with such terrible skill were dying faster than the Reich could replace them. The men who came home from the armored war came home with something that could not be left in Germany or Tunisia or Normandy. They came home with the knowledge of having been afraid, the specific, technical, perfectly rational fear of a man who has sat inside 51 millimeters of armor plate and understood that the thing across the field was not impressed by it. They came home with the sound of the 88 millimeter stored somewhere in the auditory memory where certain sounds are stored permanently and available for immediate retrieval by any stimulus that resembles what was first heard in a muddy field in Tunisia or a sunken Norman lane or the frozen Ardennes. They came home with the weight of the crewmates who had not come home, the loader from Ohio, the driver from Texas, the commander from California, the men who had shared the intercom and the coffee and the 20-odd cubic meters of steel and engine noise that constituted the entirety of their world for months at a time. Many of them said very little about it for decades. This silence was not unusual among veterans of the Second World War, but it had a particular character in the men who had served in armor. There was a shame, or something that felt like shame, in having been afraid of a machine. As if the courage required to climb into a Sherman and advance toward a Tiger were somehow diminished by the fact that the fear was mechanical in origin, mathematical in its justification. As if a man should only be afraid of another man, and not of 102 millimeters of hardened steel and an 88 millimeter gun that could reach him from a mile away. It took time, decades in many cases, for that distinction to dissolve, for the men who had carried that weight to understand that there is no hierarchy of fear in combat, that the man who climbs into a tank he knows is outgunned is performing the same act of will as the man who storms a beach under fire, and that the measure of courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision made in fear's presence. The Sherman tank itself, maligned so often in popular histories for its thinness and its combustibility, deserves a more nuanced accounting than it typically receives. It was, within the doctrine for which it was designed and the strategy it was built to serve, a success. The men inside it were, by any standard, remarkable. They were not professionals in the German sense. They had not spent years learning a craft before the war gave them occasion to apply it. They were citizen soldiers, drawn from a society that had no military tradition comparable to the Prussian tradition that shaped the Wehrmacht's officer corps. They learned on the job, in combat, against an enemy that was, in many respects, better prepared for the specific business of killing tanks. And they prevailed, not because their equipment was better, but because there were more of them than there were tigers, and because they refused, crew after crew, unit after unit, campaign after campaign, to allow the fear to be the final thing. The thermos of coffee, carried from Fort Knox to Tunisia to Normandy to the Rhine, was not a military symbol. It was not a piece of equipment issued by the War Department or cited in any field manual. It was simply the thing that a man brought from home because it tasted like home. Because warmth is necessary to human beings in cold places. Because the act of drinking coffee with another person is one of the oldest human gestures of fellowship and ordinary life. And in carrying it through the war, into the cramped hull of a Sherman, through the dust of North Africa and the rain of Normandy and the snow of the Ardennes, those men were carrying something that the Tiger, for all its 102 millimeters of frontal plate and its magnificent 88 millimeter gun, could not carry. They were carrying the weight of ordinary life, its texture and its warmth, its insistence on continuing regardless of what the mathematics of armor plate might suggest. Germany built a perfect weapon. South America built a sufficient weapon and an inexhaustible supply of the men willing to use it. The Tiger was the finest tank of its generation in terms of individual combat performance. The Sherman was the tank that won the war. Those two statements do not contradict each other. They describe, between them, the full truth of the armored war in Europe, the truth that the men who lived it understood in their bones and carried home in silence, and that the historical record has preserved for those who came after. When the last Tiger tanks in German service were destroyed or surrendered in the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was weeks from its conclusion. The Reich that had built them was already a ruin of its former self, its cities hollowed by bombing, its armies dissolved into surrender and flight, its leadership dead or captured, or hiding. The machines that had seemed, in 1942 and 1943, to represent the apex of armored warfare, sat burned out and abandoned on the roadsides of Germany, their massive hulks already beginning to rust. The Shermans moved past them, their engines running, their crews alive, moving forward. The fear had been real. The courage had been real. The coffee had grown cold many times and been reheated, or not reheated, or shared with someone who was no longer there to share it tomorrow. And in the end, as it so often does, the ordinary human persistence of ordinary human beings pressed into extraordinary circumstances had outlasted the most perfect weapon their adversary could build. The Tiger was a monument to what engineering could achieve within a closed and failing system. The Sherman was a monument to what a free society could produce when it decided to produce it. And the men who drove the Shermans toward the Tigers, knowing what waited for them, knowing the mathematics, knowing the sound, were the living measure of what that free society was willing to risk to remain free. They drove forward anyway. The thermos was empty. The war was over. And the coffee, wherever it was drunk in the years that followed, at kitchen tables in Ohio, on front porches in Georgia, in the ordinary warmth of the ordinary lives that those men had carried with them through the fire and brought home intact, tasted like something more than coffee. It tasted like the specific, irreplaceable, and terribly costly proof that fear, when confronted with enough will, is not the last word. That even in the presence of 102 millimeters of German steel and an 88 millimeter gun capable of destroying everything you trusted to keep you alive, the human decision to keep moving forward was something no tiger, however perfectly engineered, could defeat. Freedom is not the absence of the thing you fear. It is the decision to face it anyway, every morning, thermos in hand, hatch open, engine running.